The Middle Ages are often portrayed as an era of knightly tournaments, lavish feasts, and enormous wild boars roasting on spits. But here's the thing. For the vast majority of people back then, reality looked completely different. The average peasant was just one bad harvest away from an agonizing death by starvation. And that fear haunted him every day. It sounds absolutely crazy by our well-fed modern standards, doesn't it? Today we'll talk about the terrifying and ingenious tricks people of the past resorted to when food ran out for good. You'll learn about forgotten survival techniques that modern science confirms, but a modern stomach simply can't stomach. Imagine a modern supermarket where absolutely all the food has suddenly disappeared. For a medieval person, this wasn't a hypothetical disaster from a movie, but a regular seasonal problem.
Winter was considered a real test of endurance, since supplies dwindled incredibly quickly.
Modern supply chains deliver food to us from the other side of the planet in literally a day. Back then, your life depended entirely on what you could stash away in a cold cellar. People of the past didn't just sit meekly by empty hearths awaiting the inevitable end. They developed an incredibly complex survival system that included some truly wild ingredients. Have you ever tried chewing on wood for breakfast or cooking a stew out of old boots? Most likely your modern stomach would simply shut down from such a culinary shock. But the medieval gut was trained to digest what is considered ordinary trash today. Widespread famine struck European territories on average every 7 or 10 years. This is not a typographical error by historians, but the harsh mathematics of survival at that time. Every peasant was guaranteed to face the threat of starvation several times during their short life. Your stress today over a late pizza delivery seems simply absurd against this backdrop. Ancient people viewed empty granaries not as a sudden anomaly, but as a harsh part of the life cycle. And they always had a plan B ready when normal food ran out. When the wheat and rye ran out, so-called starvation foods came into play. Modern nutritionists would faint if they saw the nutritional value of these ersatz foods. People began gathering anything that even remotely resembled edible biomass. The forest suddenly transformed from a frightening source of firewood into a gigantic yet very meager pantry.
Peasants would venture into the thicket and literally strip the trees for parts.
Do you think that gathering berries and mushrooms was enough to survive? It sounds logical, but in winter or early spring, the forest has neither. Therefore, materials that required serious chemical and thermal processing were put to use. People turned to bark, acorns, roots, and even certain types of moss. Every plant was evaluated solely in terms of its caloric content and its ability to trick an empty stomach. It was a true extreme, compared to which modern survival courses look like kindergarten. But there was one huge problem with this alternative forest diet. The human stomach is physiologically incapable of digesting cellulose as effectively as cows do. We simply aren't equipped with the necessary set of enzymes to break down raw wood. If you were to eat a lot of bark today, you'd end up with severe food poisoning and intestinal blockage. However, medieval peasants figured out a way to get around this biological barrier through trial and error. They invented complex fermentation methods centuries before the advent of modern food laboratories.
Making the inedible edible required time and a tremendous amount of energy.
People spent their last ounce of strength boiling, drying, and grinding wood waste. In a sense, every peasant home turned into a small chemical factory. The process of making substitute flour could take weeks of hard work by the entire family. And all this just to get a flatbread that tasted like pressed cardboard. But this bitter flatbread gave them a chance to survive until the first spring greens appeared. Let's take a closer look at the specific strategies that allowed people to cheat death. We'll start with a product that today is associated exclusively with pig feed. But in the Middle Ages, this unassuming fruit saved more human lives than any antibiotic. I'm talking about acorns, which literally littered the ground in vast quantities. Get ready to be amazed because the process of preparing them looks like real magic. Acorns look like a great snack if you're a squirrel or a hungry wild boar, but if a person tries to eat them raw, the result will be extremely dire. They contain a huge amount of tannins, which are terribly bitter. These chemical compounds cause severe cramps, nausea, and block the absorption of nutrients. In fact, a raw acorn is a small poisonous capsule created by the tree to protect its seeds. But here is where the real science begins, which farmers discovered purely by accident. They realized that tannins dissolve very well in water, especially if it is running water.
Ancient people gathered acorns by the sackful, removed the shells, and crushed them into coarse grits.
Then they placed this mixture in woven baskets and lowered them directly into cold rivers. The water washed the crushed nuts for days on end, slowly leaching all the toxic bitterness out of them. This is essentially an ancient reverse osmosis filter, only made of vines and stones. Modern scientists call this process prolonged leaching. After several days in the river, the toxic mass turned into a completely safe carbohydrate concentrate. This wet pulp was removed from the water, thoroughly squeezed, and laid out to dry in the sun. The result was acorn flour, which was almost as caloric as wheat flour. It was full of complex carbohydrates, a little protein, and even healthy fats. Sounds like a description of a trendy superfood from a modern health food store, doesn't it? They used this acorn flour to bake dense, dark flatbreads that were incredibly filling. Of course, it didn't taste anything like a light, airy French croissant. The bread turned out heavy, with a slightly earthy flavor, and very hard once it cooled. But when your stomach is stuck to your spine from hunger, you aren't looking for Michelin stars. The main advantage of this bread was that it kept you feeling full for a long time. Acorns were digested slowly, providing the exhausted body with a steady supply of life-saving energy. Most strikingly, acorn harvesting became a distinct and very important industry. In the fall, entire villages would head out to oak groves to gather this valuable resource.
There were even special laws regulating the rights to gather acorns in manorial forests.
In England, for example, forests were measured not by area, but by how many pigs they could feed. But in years of poor harvests, people began to compete fiercely with pigs for this ground-level food. And often it was acorn cakes that helped families make it through until the first warm days. Some Native American tribes used exactly the same leaching technique. They had no contact with European farmers, yet arrived at the same conclusions. This proves that human ingenuity works the same way under critical conditions all over the world. The science of survival is universal, no matter which continent you're on. If oak trees grow nearby, a hungry brain will quickly figure out how to extract calories from them. But let's be honest, acorn flour alone was often not enough. During harsh winters, when snow blanketed the forests, it was impossible to even gather fallen fruit. And then people had to look higher, up at the trunks of the mighty trees. They began to use a resource that literally keeps the tree standing upright. I'm talking about the bark, which looks like a completely inedible piece of rough wood. But here too, medieval ingenuity showed itself in all its glory. People learned to bake bread from trees, and that's not a figure of speech at all. The process of making pine bread shocks modern nutritionists with its brutal efficiency. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But let's figure out exactly how a piece of pine turned into a nutritious meal. If you've ever touched the bark of an old pine tree, you know how hard it is. It's like armor created by nature to protect the trunk from insects and frost. Obviously, gnawing on this outer shell is pointless. You'll just break all your teeth. But medieval peasants were interested in a completely different layer of wood, hidden from view. They were looking for the phloem, a thin layer right between the rough bark and the hard wood. It is through this thinnest layer that the tree transports its nutrients from the roots to the branches. Phloem is rich in starch, vitamins, and sugars, especially in early spring, when sap flow begins. Technically, it is the most calorie-dense part of any trunk, a true source of energy for the tree. Peasants armed themselves with sharp knives and went into the forest not to chop wood, but to strip the bark from the trees. They carefully made incisions in the trunks of pines or birches and peeled off white, moist strips of bark. This process required tremendous precision, as any unnecessary movement would ruin the valuable product.
The resulting strips of bark could not simply be thrown into a cauldron or eaten raw.
They still contained too much bitter resin and indigestible fibers. Therefore, the harvested bark was first thoroughly dried over an open fire or in an oven. The heat made the fibers more brittle and helped evaporate some of the essential oils. After drying, these strips resembled very stiff and brittle pieces of parchment. But this was only half the long journey toward obtaining life-saving food. Modern scientists analyzed the composition of this pine bread and were frankly stunned. It turned out that tree bark contains a massive dose of vitamin C and valuable trace elements. During the long winter, when people were at risk of scurvy, this bitter bread literally saved them from losing their teeth. Ancient people didn't know the word avitaminosis, but their nutritional intuition worked flawlessly. They ate the bark not only out of desperation, but also as a powerful dietary supplement. This is a stunning example of how hunger forces people to find medicine right in the forest. But excessive consumption of this bread had severe physiological consequences. The enormous amount of coarse fiber literally scraped the intestinal walls from the inside. People experienced terrible stomach pains, bloating, and serious digestive problems. The body expended a great deal of energy trying to push this wood shavings through the digestive tract. Nevertheless, between stomach pain and death from starvation, the choice was absolutely clear. Interestingly, different types of trees yielded completely different culinary results. Pine was considered the true standard of quality, as its bark was the most nutritious.
Birch produced a sweeter but less caloric flour, which was often used in the spring.
But the bark of oak or willow was used only in the most desperate moments. It was too bitter, and even long boiling could not remedy this. Peasants were true connoisseurs of tree trunks, perfectly versed in the nuances of bark flavor. At the same time, the mass harvesting of bark caused irreparable damage to the forest itself. If the bark is stripped from a tree in a circular pattern, it inevitably withers and dies. Therefore, in some regions, lords forbade peasants from damaging timber trees even during famines. Imagine the level of cruelty. People are dying of starvation, yet they are forbidden to touch the lord's pine trees. This forced peasants to venture deeper and deeper into the wild thickets, risking encounters with wolves or bandits. Bark and acorns solve the problem of carbohydrates, but the body also vitally needs protein. Without protein, muscles begin to waste away, and a person simply loses the ability to move and work. Hunting in the Lord's forest was punishable by hanging, so large game was off limits. And so the eyes of desperate people turned to what usually inspires only disgust. The following survival strategy proves that hunger completely shuts down the sense of revulsion. When we hear about eating insects, Asian markets with fried grasshoppers come to mind. It seems to us that such exoticism was completely foreign to medieval Europe. But hunger works as the world's best eraser of cultural taboos and squeamishness. When your children are crying from exhaustion, any biomass that crawls or flies becomes food. European peasants quickly mastered protein-gathering methods that survival experts use today. The most accessible and abundant source of protein in the spring was the common earthworm. Sounds disgusting, doesn't it? But the earthworm consists of nearly 80% pure protein. In terms of nutritional value, a handful of large worms is quite comparable to a good beefsteak. People collected them after heavy rains, when the worms themselves crawled en masse to the surface. They were rinsed in water to clean the intestines of soil and then thrown into a boiling pot. But the marshes also concealed a more calorie-dense, albeit slippery, catch. Frogs, snails, and freshwater bivalves became a true delicacy during years of famine. In France, the love for frog legs and snails originated precisely as a survival strategy for the poor. What is served today in expensive Parisian restaurants with garlic sauce was originally a food of desperation. Peasants simply boiled these amphibians in huge cauldrons to get at least some broth. Gathering this marsh food was an incredibly arduous and dangerous task. People waded through icy water for hours, risking severe colds or swamp fever. Leeches latched onto their legs and sharp reeds cut their hands until they bled. My feet start to freeze just thinking about this icy ordeal. But it was the only chance to bring home even a few calories before the start of the farming season. The threat of starvation forced people to ignore the icy water and the constant pain in their joints. In coastal regions, seaweed washed ashore by storms became a lifeline. People in Ireland and Scotland gathered dark red seaweed, known as dulse, in large quantities. They dried it in the wind and then chewed it like a salty, slightly rubbery snack. The seaweed provided the body with iodine and essential minerals, preventing many serious illnesses. Today, this product is sold to vegans in trendy packaging as a sea superfood. But in the Middle Ages, it was the food of the poor, who couldn't afford fish. Forest anthills also did not escape the attention of resourceful and hungry people. Ant larvae, which look like tiny white grains of rice, are extremely rich in fats and proteins. Obtaining them was no easy task, as the enraged ants desperately defended their home. Peasants would stick sticks into the anthill so that the insects would drag the larvae to a safe place. Then they would quickly gather this precious protein harvest into sturdy canvas bags. The larvae were roasted on flat stones near the fire until they became crispy. They had a slightly sour taste due to formic acid, which served as a substitute for expensive spices. This was not merely survival, it was a true dietary adaptation to extreme conditions. The human brain is incredibly adaptable when it comes to finding energy sources. People learn to perceive the forest not as a landscape, but as a complex and harsh pantry. But all these methods required enormous energy expenditure for gathering and constant movement. What if a blizzard is raging outside and it's physically impossible to leave the house? In such moments, people had to seek calories right inside their cramped dwellings. And here we come to one of the darkest and most terrifying survival strategies. This practice sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but it was absolutely real. Imagine a long, merciless winter when snowdrifts have buried the doors up to the roof. You are locked inside the house with your family and a few pets you managed to save. Your grain supplies ran out a month ago, and the acorns and dried bark have been eaten down to the last crumb. You have one cow left, which can barely stand on its own legs from exhaustion and the cold. The logical step would be to slaughter the animal to get plenty of meat and feed your family until they're full. But here's the main problem with this obvious solution. If you kill the cow in winter, the meat will run out quickly, and in spring you'll have nothing to plow with. Killing your only draft animal meant signing your own death warrant for the following year. Without a cow or a horse, you won't be able to sow the field, which means you'll surely die the following winter. That's why farmers adopted a brilliant, though incredibly cruel, approach to this problem. They began using the animal as a renewable source of calories without taking its life. This practice is known among many nomadic tribes, but in Europe it was employed out of sheer desperation. The owner would take a sharp knife and make a small, precise incision in the neck of his cow or horse. He would drain a little fresh, hot blood into a bowl, taking care not to take too much. Blood is pure protein, iron, and essential minerals, perfectly absorbed by the human body. The collected blood was not drunk raw, as this carried a huge risk of contracting dangerous infections. It was mixed with meager scraps of flour, oats, or even ground bark to thicken it. This dark, eerie mixture was poured onto a hot skillet and fried until it formed a thick pancake. In England, this dish evolved and became the precursor to the famous black pudding. What is served today as part of a classic British breakfast was originally a harsh survival tactic during blizzards. Horses tolerated this procedure much better than cows thanks to their powerful build and endurance. Genghis Khan's Mongol army built its entire phenomenal logistics system on this principle. Their warriors could go weeks without relying on supply trains, using their horses as portable calorie reservoirs. In a peasant's hut, however, this procedure was fraught with heavy emotional burden and despair. No one wanted to cause pain to an animal that was considered almost a full-fledged member of the family. In winter, livestock often lived under the same roof as people, warming the house with their body heat. Therefore, bloodletting was always a last resort when the children could no longer stand on their feet. The owner literally cut a piece of the animal's health to pass it on to his loved ones. If winter dragged on, even this cruel method ceased to save the day. An emaciated cow stopped giving blood, grew weaker, and eventually simply dropped dead. And then every single part of the animal's body was used, without a single exception. The bones were crushed with heavy stones and boiled for days on end to extract the last drops of nutritious bone marrow. This white, fatty broth was a true lifesaver for the frozen and exhausted people. But the most surprising part began when there was no meat, no bones, and no blood left. Do you think that was the end of the edible supplies in the house? You're wrong, because people's eyes turned to everyday household items and clothing. People began boiling in cauldrons, things that a modern person would simply throw in the trash. The next chapter will prove to you that the concept of edible is a very relative and elastic term. Look around you and find any item made of genuine leather. Maybe it's your favorite belt, winter boots, or an old jacket in the closet. To you, these are simply wardrobe items with a certain utilitarian or aesthetic value. But for a starving person in the Middle Ages, it was a stored, preserved piece of animal protein. Yes, you understood perfectly correctly. When food ran out, people began to cook and eat their shoes. It sounds like a ridiculous scene from an old Charlie Chaplin comedy, where he elegantly chews on shoelaces. But in historical reality, there was absolutely nothing funny or elegant about this process. Leather is a dried, chemically treated animal hide consisting mainly of durable collagen. Collagen is a protein, which means, in theory, it can be digested and absorbed by the body. The only problem is how to make this tough piece of material suitable for chewing. You can't just bite off a chunk of an old boot. You'll break your jaw and get nowhere. The leather had been tanned and treated with salts, ash, and often highly toxic substances. Therefore, the first step in making shoe soup was to boil out the toxins slowly and thoroughly. Leather belts, scabbards, and old saddles were cut into small pieces to increase the surface area in contact with the water. They were thrown into boiling water and simmered for hours, with the dark, foul-smelling water constantly being changed. After long boiling, the pieces of leather did not become tender like marbled beef. They turned into a rubbery, viscous mass that had to be chewed for a very long time and with great effort. But the very process of prolonged chewing had a powerful psychological effect on a starving person. The brain received a signal that the jaws were working, and the illusion of eating slightly calmed the panic. This rubbery mass filled the stomach, dulling the unbearable, piercing pain of the emptiness inside. Modern nutritionists would call this negative calorie food, but it provided a feeling of fullness. People often singed pieces of leather over an open fire until they blistered and became brittle. Then this charred crust was ground into a powder between stones and added to a liquid broth. It was a kind of leather protein powder from the harsh Middle Ages. In addition to leather, other items made from natural animal materials were also thrown into the cauldron. Horns, hooves, and even wool scraps were also used in an attempt to turn them into a source of calories. The horns were boiled for a long time until they released a viscous, glue-like substance to the bottom of the cauldron. Essentially, people were cooking primitive wood glue and then greedily eating it. It coated the stomach walls, relieving spasms and providing the body with a minimal dose of amino acids. When we read about this today, a logical question arises about the human psyche. How did people not go mad, feeding on old boots and boiled horns for weeks on end? The answer lies in our brain's amazing ability to adapt to any, even the most horrific conditions. The instinct for self-preservation shuts down disgust, turning survival into a purely mechanical, mathematical process. You must put biomass in your mouth so that your heart will continue to beat tomorrow morning. It is a simple, brutal logic in which there is no room for culinary whims. However, the human body's ability to digest garbage is not limitless, and resources are running out. When all the belts have been eaten, when there is no bark left in the forest, and the ground is frozen solid, at that moment, people turn to the most insane source of minerals, which literally lay at their feet. They began to eat the very earth on which their frozen, empty homes stood. This phenomenon has a scientific name and conceals within it the astonishing medical mysteries of the past. Eating soil seems to us a sign of deep mental disorder or absolute madness. In modern medicine, this is called geophagy and usually indicates a serious mineral deficiency in the body. But for medieval peasants during periods of great famine, earth literally became their last resort. People did not eat ordinary black soil from their garden beds. They sought out very specific, particular types of soil. They were interested in clay that lay deep beneath the layer of fertile soil on the slopes of ravines. In some regions of Europe, there were entire deposits of so-called edible earth. During years of famine, merchants even brought this special light-colored clay to the markets and sold it for money. It was considered a valuable resource that had to be carefully cleaned of sand and small stones. Women would mix the clay with a large amount of water and wait for the heavy sand to settle to the bottom. Then they would carefully drain off the murky clay water and boil it down until a soft paste formed. But this earthen diet came at a very high and terrible price. The human digestive tract is not adapted to transport a heavy, sticky, and completely indigestible mass. The clay often clumped into dense lumps inside the body, causing fatal blockages. Modern science confirms that animals regularly eat soil in the wild. Parrots peck at clay cliffs to neutralize the poisons from toxic seeds they have swallowed. Deer and elephants travel dozens of miles to find salt licks and mud springs to replenish minerals. A person driven to the brink by extreme hunger simply reverted to his deep animal instincts. The mind shut down, giving way to a mammal's primitive survival mechanisms in a hostile environment. Religious leaders of the time often saw the eating of earth as divine punishment. Preachers from their pulpits cried out that people had become like worms crawling in the dust for their sins. They urged people to pray and repent, rather than seek ways to deceive their empty stomachs. But prayers did not add calories, while gray clay cakes at least offered hope of surviving until morning. So the peasants listened humbly to the sermons, then went to the ravine to dig for life-saving clay. When winter finally receded, the survivors faced new, no less difficult trials. A body accustomed to digesting sawdust, skin, and dirt could not immediately return to normal food. If such a person were suddenly fed fatty meat, they could die from pancreatic shock. Today, doctors call this refeeding syndrome, which killed people after prolonged starvation in the 20th century. Medieval people did not know this term, but they intuitively understood the danger of sudden abundance. They emerged from starvation slowly, subsisting for weeks on nothing but thin broths and light soups. And here we come to another aspect of medieval life, where people survived in different ways. All the previous methods, however primitive they may seem, applied to villages and endless forests. But what about those who found themselves locked behind the high stone walls of crowded European cities? There was no bark there, nor clean clay, but there were plenty of other, very nimble sources of protein. And hunting them turned into a real battle for survival on the cobblestone streets. While peasants chewed bark in the forests, the inhabitants of besieged cities faced their own unique problems. Stone walls protected against enemy swords, but turned the city into a giant trap, locked from the inside. When the grain in the granaries ran out, the townspeople had nowhere to go for acorns or marsh reeds. They began methodically and ruthlessly exterminating the entire urban fauna, starting with the most harmless animals. To the great regret of modern animal rights activists, pets and man's faithful companions were the first to be sent to the cauldron. The danger of eating rats lay not in their taste, but in the horrific diseases they carried. These rodents were walking reservoirs for plague-carrying fleas, typhus, and a host of other deadly infections. But to contract the plague, you had to be bitten by a flea. Boiled meat itself was safe. The main rule was to boil the rat for an incredibly long time, literally dissolving its bones. Boiling water killed the bacteria, turning the dangerous pest into a thick, albeit foul-smelling broth. Pigeons and crows were also subjected to total extermination using snares, nets, and plain old stones. City squares, usually teeming with birds, became completely empty and eerily quiet during the famine. Boys would climb the highest church spires, risking a fatal fall for a nest of pigeon eggs. They drank the eggs raw right on the spot so as not to break them during the dangerous descent. Every bird was viewed as a flying source of calories that could not be missed under any circumstances. Interestingly, the city's elite often tried to save their hunting dogs and thoroughbred horses. Wealthy patricians hid their pets in cellars, feeding them the scraps of their own meager meals. But the crowd of starving townspeople did not forgive such blatant injustice in moments of collective survival. There are known cases where the mob forcibly broke into castles just to eat the count's hounds. Hunger was the greatest equalizer, erasing the line between a duke and an ordinary shoemaker. Even the city's refuse was processed with terrifying, almost industrial efficiency and mathematical precision. People gathered meat bones that had been discarded in the trash for years and threw them back into the cauldrons. These old sun-bleached bones were pounded in stone mortars into a gray powder. This bone dust was mixed into bread, producing an incredibly heavy product that broke people's teeth. It provided no energy, but it contained calcium and cemented the stomach shut, suppressing the feeling of hunger. The use of old bones led to the emergence of a terrifying phenomenon known as bread from the graveyard. Some records indicate that it wasn't just animal bones from garbage dumps that were used. desperate people dug up old graves to obtain human bones for the production of the surrogate flour. Baked goods made from this dust had a slightly sweet taste and caused horrific mass poisonings from cadaveric toxins. But the fear of imminent death drove people to cemeteries, forcing them to ignore any logical risks. City authorities tried to combat the panic by issuing instructions on how to make bread out of nothing. City halls were ordered to mix leftover flour with sawdust, straw, and even crushed brick. This brick bread was distributed via ration cards to create the appearance of caring for the dying population. Red brick dust gave the flatbreads a meaty color, creating a gruesome visual illusion of normal food. This was the height of food despair, after which the darkest and most terrifying things began. When fresh food is scarce, people begin to view spoiled food in a completely different light. Modern people immediately throw away a piece of meat if it has changed color or smell even slightly. But in the Middle Ages, the concept of spoilage was incredibly flexible and depended on the level of hunger. Ancient people discovered a brilliant mechanism. The line between decay and fermentation is sometimes very thin. Controlled decomposition became one of the main strategies for preserving calories during the long winter months. The most striking example of this phenomenon is the famous Scandinavian fermented fish known as surströmming. In the Middle Ages, salt cost a fortune, and peasants could not afford proper salting. Therefore, fish were simply placed in barrels with a minimal amount of salt and left to rot slowly. The bacteria that developed did not kill the fish outright, but put it into a state of vigorous fermentation. The smell of this barrel could knock a horse off its feet and bring tears to the eyes of even the toughest Viking. It resembles the concentrated aroma of rotten eggs mixed with the stench of a clogged city sewer. But inside the barrel, true chemical magic was taking place, saving people's lives during the polar night. Bacteria predigested the protein, making it incredibly easy for an emaciated human body to absorb. People ate this slimy mass, receiving a massive boost of energy, acids, and essential micronutrients. In Southern Europe, fermentation took on other, no less strange but more plant-based forms. Fallen and rotting fruit was never thrown away. It was carefully collected in wooden tubs. This mass was left to ferment until it turned into a pungent, cloudy fruit vinegar. The vinegar killed all disease-causing bacteria in the water, making it safe to drink during epidemics. Additionally, tough roots and tough meat could be soaked in this acidic solution. Rotten grain infected with ergot was not thrown away either, because there was simply no other grain available. Ergot is a toxic fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and constriction of blood vessels. Eating such bread led to epidemics of so-called St. Anthony's fire, characterized by mass hallucinations. Entire villages could go mad, screaming in pain from blackened limbs and seeing demons. But the peasants still baked this poisoned bread because the alternative was certain starvation. Cheese also originally emerged as a way to save milk, which inevitably began to sour in the heat. Sour milk was poured into the stomachs of calves, where natural enzymes curdled the mass into a dense lump. Moldy, rock-hard cheese could be stored for years in cold, damp mountain caves. What is today called noble blue mold and costs a fortune was a lifesaver for shepherds. The mold protected the product from the intrusion of other deadly bacteria, acting as a natural antibiotic. If beef began to smell off, it was rubbed with ash and wild garlic. The ash created an alkaline environment on the surface of the meat in which putrefactive bacteria could not multiply. On the outside, such a piece looked like a charred stone, but inside the meat remained tender and pink. Some chefs still use this technique today to create a unique texture in steaks. The difference is that in a restaurant, it's a culinary experiment, whereas in the Middle Ages, it was a matter of survival. When studying this fine line between decay and life-saving fermentation, one is struck by the boldness of these desperate people. They tested every recipe on their own stomachs, and many experiments ended in a painful and fatal outcome. The preservation methods that have survived to this day are the results of successful attempts to survive in hell. The mistakes of history remain buried in village cemeteries as nameless mounds beneath crooked wooden crosses. And the victors passed on their smelly, strange, yet ingenious recipes to the next generations of survivors. When we hear the word cannibalism, we usually picture mad savages from adventure novels. But in medieval Europe, eating one's own kind was not part of some exotic ritual. It was an act of absolute extreme desperation when the human brain literally shut down all social barriers. Chronicles of the Great Famine of 1315 are rife with gruesome accounts of people eating corpses. The church strictly forbade even thinking about it, but the fear of starvation proved stronger than the fear of hell. It is important to understand that people very rarely killed someone specifically for food. For the most part, it was necrophagic cannibalism, the consumption of those who had already died of starvation or disease. The bodies of deceased relatives were hidden from neighbors and authorities to be secretly used as a source of protein. It sounds so horrific that the modern mind refuses to fully comprehend or process it. But in a snowbound village cut off from the world, a dead body was seen as the only chance for the rest to survive. In folklore, this fear was reflected in the form of fairy tales that we read to our children today. The famous story of Hansel and Gretel is not a sweet fairy tale about a gingerbread house. It is a grim reflection of reality when parents led their children into the forest so as not to witness their deaths. In the image of the evil witch who eats children is a metaphor for that very primal fear of cannibals. Fairy tales served as a warning to children. Don't stray far from home or you'll become someone's dinner. Moral principles, logic, and empathy simply shut down as unnecessary to conserve energy. A person becomes pure instinct, programmed solely to seek out any available calories. Therefore, judging them by our well-fed modern standards is pointless and even a bit hypocritical. You never know what you're capable of until you go a month without a crumb of bread. Fortunately, periods when people had to resort to such extremes were rare. In most cases, peasants had enough resourcefulness, acorns, and bark to hold out until the spring sun. And as soon as the snow melted, people rushed into the woods for the first edible herbs and roots. Nettles, dandelions, and wild sorrel seemed to them, after the winter nightmare, the finest delicacies in the world. Life slowly returned to the villages, and the grim winter recipes were forgotten until the next poor harvest. This entire survival system shaped the unique genetic profile of European populations. Only those whose bodies could efficiently store fat in the summer and use it sparingly in the winter survived. The modern obesity epidemic is a direct result of the successful work of genes hardened by medieval famine. Our bodies still think winter is coming and store every extra calorie for later. What kills us today with heart disease saved our ancestors from death 1,000 years ago. When we look at history through the lens of food security, it looks completely different. Battles, kings, and intrigues pale in comparison to the silent, daily feat of the ordinary person seeking sustenance. These people did not build grand cathedrals or write philosophical treatises on the meaning of life. They were engaged in a far more important task, preserving the human race under unbearable conditions. Their ingenuity in the search for calories deserves far more respect than the exploits of many military leaders. By studying their methods, we gain a better understanding of the hidden capabilities of our own amazing bodies. We realize just how fragile our modern civilization is, dependent as it is on uninterrupted food supplies. If logistics collapsed tomorrow, most of us simply wouldn't know what to do in the woods. But our ancestors' knowledge hasn't vanished. It's simply biding its time in the pages of history. In a pinch, we can always remember how to soak acorns and roast pine bark. Ultimately, the story of medieval survival is not just a tale of suffering and filth. It is a stunning ode to human resilience, ingenuity, and the will to live against all odds. People of the past possessed incredible practical knowledge of nature, which we have almost completely lost today. They understood plant chemistry, animal physiology, and the properties of minerals without any university laboratories. Their science was harsh, brutal, written in blood and hunger, but it worked flawlessly in practice. Today, we complain about the lack of our favorite flavor of chips or the long wait for sushi delivery on a Friday night. But it's worth pausing for just a second to remember what our ancestors went through so that we could be born. They chewed wood, swallowed clay, and boiled old shoes simply to continue their lineage. Each of us is a direct descendant of those very resilient people with incredibly tough stomachs. And honestly, That sounds cooler than belonging to any modern aristocratic dynasty. You are the result of the harshest evolutionary selection imaginable. So the next time you're standing in a huge, bright, and warm supermarket, just look around at the endless shelves filled with thousands of kinds of food from every corner of our planet. Realize what an absolute incredible miracle this is by the standards of all human history. We live in an era of unprecedented abundance that would have seemed like a true biblical paradise to medieval peasants. Appreciate your food, remember the harsh lessons of the past, and don't forget to feed your inner survivor. Thanks for watching and take care of your supplies.